lecture in series PD Prehistory, sponsored by the Archaeological Institute 3D at Florence County Museum. This has been a wonderful lecture series. Those who've been with us in previous lectures, we've had really leaders in the fields of archaeology and prehistory talking about the Paleolithic period, the Archaic period. Last lecture 2 weeks ago, we had Chris Judge here talking about the Woodland period. And tonight, we're going to talk about the last of these periods, the most recent of them, the Mississippian period. We can almost say, I think, the best for last. I've always been fascinated by the Mississippian period. It is, at least in PD, it's kind of an ironic period because it's the period we know the most about because it's the closest contact. It's got the best developed sort of social structure and iconography, and it feels more like a modern society than anything else we deal with in prehistory. But in the PD, it's the most loose. There really wasn't a centralized piece of data we found. There really wasn't a sort of center in the PD like you see throughout other places throughout the Southeast. So there's a real mystery about the Mississippian period. Fortunately, in about a week, less than a week, the Archaeological Institute of PD is going to be undertaking an excavation down in Florence County on a Mississippian site that we hope is going to tell us a lot more about the period and help add to the knowledge that we got about the Mississippian period. Before I introduce our speaker, I will say that dig is going to be going on from the 16th to the 27th. We are accepting volunteers. We'd love to have you come out and help and watch and learn a little bit. If you're interested, Chris Judge with the Native American Studies Institute at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster is going to be leading that effort. And if you're interested in coming out, if you're interested in volunteering, call or text him. A great crowd out there. We feel confident that we're on a pretty significant site. I think there'll be some good things coming out of them. So hope you'll come out and join us. We are fortunate tonight to have one of the preeminent scholars of the Mississippian period with us tonight, Dr. Adam King. Dr. King is the director of South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. He's also a research professor at the University of South Carolina. He received his BA and PhD from Penn State University and an MA in archaeology from the University of Georgia. He has worked throughout the Southeast, particularly in the Etowah culture in Georgia, on the Mississippi period. He's also worked extensively on the most physically proximate, closest Mississippian center, traditional Mississippian center we have in the Mulberry site near Camden. He's been one of the lead researchers on that and written some fascinating stuff about Mulberry and about Mississippi culture in general. So it's a real privilege to have him here. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome Dr. Adam King.
All right, thank you. In the city constellation, I was born in Virginia, so I may really not be Yankee, but I'm not sure. I appreciate you coming out. I appreciate the invitation to come here and talk. And it really is sort of a cool thing that Ben has set up with the Institute, but also with a series of talks, because if you've been following along, it's taking you through the different time periods and the deep past of Indigenous people here in South Carolina. And I'm going to be talking about the latest end of the time period, what we call Mississippian. And in addition to sort of introducing the archaeology, it's also creating a research context in a sense. There's some questions that Ben and the Institute can answer with the archaeology that goes on. I'm going to say up front, I am not a Native American. I don't have any indigenous blood. What I'm talking about is not the way Native Americans necessarily think about their past or talk about their past. I'm talking about it from the perspective of Western archaeology. So I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not. I'm talking about it from the perspective of archaeology. And it's important to remember that there are indigenous people here. There are indigenous people in the country who remain deeply interested in the archaeology here and the archaeology in other places in the Southeast. And I'll be honest, coming up as an archaeologist when I was trained, we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about the fact that there were people people still here that care, are interested, and want to be involved. And that's an important thing to recognize. All right, so Mississippian is fun because it's when you have some of the biggest, most complex kinds of societies that developed in the Southeast, in the indigenous Southeast. Maybe not quite as big and complicated in most cases as what you saw in Mesoamerica, but still equally impressive and equally interesting. All right, let's see. Nope. All right, what button am I pushing here?
You have to turn it on. I think there's an on-off switch on it.
Well, that's beyond my pay grade for that. There we go. And part of it is what we call social complexity. Probably compared to earlier indigenous societies, these are more centralized. There are powerful leaders ruling over or at least controlling large areas of land, multiple communities, maybe thousands, tens of thousands of people. And that's something that's a little bit different than maybe what came before. And they're doing that from big, impressive places where they're building platform mounds and arranging them around plazas. And we've got the Etowah site in northwest Georgia on the left here, and that big mound is 70 feet tall. And we've got the Moundville site in central Alabama with its 20 mounds. So they're building big, impressive places. And the thing to keep in mind with these big, impressive places and other things is they represent people doing things. They represent labor. And so the bigger and more impressive, the more those leaders were able to convince people to come do the work to create these things. The other thing about Mississippian is that there's a lot of really elaborate, really spectacular, you could call them art objects, and I think it's fair to think of them in artistic quality as great as anything humanity has created. They're spectacular things. They weren't created as art. They're really ritual paraphernalia, ritual regalia. They're things that people who ran ritual used to actually do the ritual. But we've got things made of, it's a little fuzzy down there, those are copper plates made from local copper, cold hammered thin, and then embossed. And we've got a shell gorget made out of the outer world of a conch shell. If anybody's ever tried to carve shell, and this thing's about this big, and cut out that design, that's not something somebody woke up one day and decided to do. These are people who were incredibly skilled and trained their entire lives and created amazing things. And you've got a pottery vessel, and this is just, thank goodness for National Geographic, this is a National Geographic drawing of an individual being dressed up in some of this, and again, it's really ritual regalia and paraphernalia. So there's spectacular stuff that comes with Mississippian material. This is the culture, in a sense, that European intruders encountered when they got here. When DeSoto came through the interior Southeast in 1539 and 1543, he left a lot of great descriptions of indigenous societies from the panhandle of Florida all the way out to the Mississippi River, and those are all Mississippian culture. We'll find out that there's a lot of difference within it, but this is what DeSoto encountered. This is what the French encountered coming down the Mississippi River. We've got great descriptions of sort of the later end of this. So as Ben alluded to, one of the reasons we have a lot of information about the organization of Mississippian societies is because of these descriptions, which give us information that archaeology doesn't. The other thing to remember is the Mississippian, and I'll show a map in a second, goes from the prairie plains all the way to the southern Atlantic, the Gulf, to the Ohio River Valley, but it's not all the same. It wasn't all the same people. Different ethnic groups with their own history, their own traditions, and their own language. And those people, as a result of European contact, became the indigenous societies that we know in the historic period, and again, that are still here today. And we can talk about Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Pee, Chickasaw, a whole bunch of different groups. Those are the descendants of Mississippian, and they're descendants of what happened to indigenous societies as a result of European contact. So there's a lot of diversity in what we're going to call Mississippi. So, Mississippian is an archaeological term. That means archaeologists made it up. It doesn't, The people that were there at that time didn't call themselves, nobody calls themselves that. It's something archaeologists define based on material culture, on stuff. And at this point, Mississippian has several different sort of pieces to it. One is just the time period. You see I've got 900 to 1600. You can get 5 Mississippianists in here and we'll argue about whether those dates are actually right, but somewhere in there, the earliest maybe around 900 or 1000. In some places, Mississippian goes up into maybe even the 1700s in terms of a set of practices. But it's a time period. It's also geography in a sense. And again, you can get several people to argue over whether that map accurately reflects where Mississippian is or isn't. And that's really not all that interesting. It's sort of that area there. The key is Mississippian was defined based on some material characteristics and some organizational characteristics. And again, there's a huge amount of diversity that goes across all of this area, but it's those material practices and the organization that make it Mississippian. And you can see corn agriculture, a reliance on intensive gardening, really corn, beans, and squash. But corn was the main staple. But you can go from season to season, place to place, and the amount people relied on corn would vary based on a lot of things. But corn agriculture is a key part of it. And remember, corn and beans were domesticated in Central America. They come into the eastern U.S. in maybe 0 AD, and the corn doesn't really become a staple until after it goes through some changes around 800 or 900 AD. It becomes a key staple crop. And being an agriculturalist implies some things about the way you live your life, because there's a whole cycle to planting. There's a tie to specific places and gardens and things like that. So it ties people to places, and it also allows people to congregate because it produces a surplus that can be stored. And so it has an impact on how you live your life. One of the key material markers, and I'll show some images of it, you've seen a few already, platform mounds, piles of dirt, right, but they're flat top. Mounding goes back to, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago here in eastern U.S. In fact, here in eastern U.S., indigenous people were building mounds before the Maya were building pyramids on top of stone and things. It started here first. But when you get Mississippian is the end of a tradition that starts in probably the middle Archaean, goes through the woodland period. What's different about Mississippian is they're building platform mounds and they're putting things on top of it. And I'll talk a little bit about what they're putting on top of it. So another sort of material marker of Mississippian is these mounds. And then the key organizational characteristic is ranked societies. What it really means is that within these societies, some people were inherently more important and better off than everybody else, and they were born that way. And that's different. That's the way our society works. But if you go back in time, that's less likely to be the case in the indigenous past. That you have this, what we call institutionalized social ranking. Some families are more important than others. If you're born into it, you're more important than everybody else. And it's out of those small, most important people, that small group of most important people in any society, they're the religious, political, and social leaders. And so you have a hierarchical organization to society. And that's another key part of Mississippian. And you might ask yourself, well, how do you see that in the archaeological record? And I'm not going to talk about that. All right, so I mentioned this already, but gardening, right? Gardening, corn, beans, and squash, and also mixing it with a much older tradition of hunting and gathering. There are no domesticated animals per se, although anybody who lives around here and hunts deer know that deer and humans have been domesticated with each other for a long time. But again, this impacts the settlement, the size of settlement, what you do most of the year, a whole bunch of different things. And then that doesn't show up as well as I would like, but the platform mounds. This is Etowah again on the left, and you can't see it really well, but the girl and the white woman in the white shirt is on top of the mound, and the other two are on the bottom of the mound. This is in Allendale County. This is the Lawton site, and that mound is about 6 feet tall. I've actually been at mound sites where the mound is that tall. And the size of the mound, these things weren't built all at once, in fact. I do that. These things weren't built all at once, they're built in stages. So they build one, they put a building or do something on top of it, and And then eventually they would cover it over, do it again, cover it over, do it again. So, for example, the big mound at Etowah was built over 300 years. Some of these things take a long time. And the size of it may be impressive to a certain extent, but the real thing about these mounds is what we know linguistically from some of the communities that are still around today is in a lot of cases the word for a mound is the same as the earth. These things are representations of the earth, and the mound is really a symbol. It's a symbol of the earth. And what does it mean when you live on top of a mound? You live on top of the earth. What does it mean when you conduct religious ceremonies from the top of the mound? You're on top of the earth. What does it mean when you cover over that mound with a new layer of dirt? You're renewing the earth. So the people that can do that are doing special things. And that's, as far as we understand, a key piece of what made people important during the Mississippian period. They acted as intermediaries between the deities and everybody else. And they continually did things to remind everybody of that, and living on the mound, building a mound, conducting a ceremony on the mound was a key part of it. And we'll come back to that when we talk about the absence of mounds in PD. But the mound, as much as anything, was a symbol to be manipulated by people. And just so we can have the poor people's houses on top of mounds, political and religious theater on top of mounds. This is Monk's Mound. I'll show you another image of it. The one at the top is near St. Louis. It's the biggest Mississippian mound that was ever built. It's called Monk's Mound because there was a cabin of Trappist monks that lived on top of it in the 1800s. But these are things, these are buildings. Some people are buried in them. A lot of Mississippian platform mounds weren't necessarily functioning as burial mounds like during the woodland there for other purposes, but that intimate association between the mound and earth, the important people. So here's a map, and again, you can get people to argue over this. The little dots show the Mississippian mounds, the distribution of Mississippian mounds. You know lots of them on this, but you get the sense there were a lot of them. A lot of them have been destroyed, a lot of them are gone, plowed down, bulldozed away, destroyed by development. But you might notice, how's the PD looking in there? It's looking a little empty. That doesn't mean there isn't a mound here. But, so you get a sense of where Mississippian is and where these mounds are. So we've got them here, right? We've got the Fort Watson or Santee Mound in Clarendon County. And we've got mounds that I've worked on in the Wateree Valley, for example, Mulberry. And along the Savannah River, there are lots and lots of mounds too. So there are Mississippian mounds throughout South Carolina. And then, of course, one of the closer ones here that's on the PED is at Town Creek up in North Carolina. So they're around. In terms of other sort of material things that go with Mississippian, pottery develops long before Mississippian. What happens with Mississippian in agriculture in a lot of cases is vessel walls become thinner and a lot more forms are developed because they're doing a lot more different sorts of things, including cooking over fires and stuff like that. But we have plain, and I don't know whether you can see it, but there's a design on this one on the lower left that's called complicated stamped. There's a wooden paddle that the design is carved in. As the coils are formed together, you're squishing the stamp onto it. When it's fired, it stays there. And it's not just a random design. That's a meaningful thing. All of this stuff has meaning to it. When you see a multicolored slip, and then you see a negative painted vessel over there, and you familiar with negative painting? They would make the vessel, then you guys are, I can tell. They would cover it in like beeswax, and then they would scrape off the design, dip the whole thing in a slip, and then fire it again. And the beeswax melts away, so the slip only sticks where they scraped it away. And so you see that's what you get there, which is pretty cool. So pottery and different styles of decoration of pottery across the Mississippian area and over time. Groundstone. Groundstone pops up as people start to focus more on plant foods. So we go way back to the Middle Archaic, early Archaic to see grinding stones and things like that. And we see them in Mississippian because they're eating corn and they're grinding corn, but we see there's a celt, and that's probably not that's a display item, that's not a working celt, but celts are probably came about for clearing for gardens as much as anything. Can you chop down a tree with that? How do you take down a tree with one of those? You girdle it, right? Girdle it, it dies, burn it down. But we see other things that are made out of ground stone. That thing in the middle is a chunky stone. Call it a chunky stone, it looks like a hockey puck, right? We know in the historic period, indigenous people were playing a game called chunky. One person rolls it, two other people throw spears or sticks, and whoever's spear comes closest to where the thing falls over, they won. And in the historic period, they talk about people, men gambling, doing this. But when you read some of the indigenous narratives, there's a lot more to it than just that. That may have been a representation of the sun. It may have had a role in ritual that you could see into the future. There's a lot more to it. But that's a pretty, that's another piece of ritual paraphernalia. And then that little guy over there is a pipe. It's made out of soapstone. That was found at the Hollywood site, which is right on, near Augusta, right on the Georgia-South Carolina border. So they're making things out of ground stone, and you get the sense that some of the things that they're making out of all of these materials that have been around for a while, they're making pretty fancy stuff. Flake stone, if you saw the archaic, people are making a lot out of flake stone. You get to the Mississippian, and most of what you find in terms of flake stone are those little triangular projectiles that are about this big. And they're not the most impressive things, but they're perfectly good for arrow tips. And we see less of other kinds of stone tools, but we do see things rarely like that, which is a flint blade that's about this big. Can you imagine anybody who do flint knapping? Can you imagine flint knapping? You're going to start with a big chunk of rock like this, and that thing is about that thin. That would have been another piece of ritual paraphernalia. And marine shell. Marine shell had been moving around the eastern U.S. since the early Archaic. And we see it in the Mississippian, we see it as beads and earplugs, but we also see it in some areas as shell cups. The inner part of the whelk shell is taken out. We also see it with those shell orchids again, which is the outer world of the whelk shell that's then carved. So shell, marine shell, but they're also doing elaborate stuff with it. And again, those reference deities, they reference the supernatural, and they're part of what people who interacted with the supernatural used in war. Copper. Copper has been used by indigenous people since, again, probably the late Archaic up in the Great Lakes and throughout the middle woodland here. And we see it here. They're not making tools out of it. Why is copper not the best thing to make a chopping tool out of? It's too soft, right? And that's not what that is. That's a cell, but that's a display of it. And those are copper plates. Again, they're about this big, they're about that thin, and they're embossed and decorated. They're items that are part of a person's regalia. So we see copper again, but we see them putting it to different uses. And again, when you look at these things, I want you to think about the fact that that was an expert that did that. That was somebody who trained their entire lives to create something like that. It's also important to remember that that thing had an incredible amount of meaning and a lot of sacredness to it. So we got the material stuff, but then we've got organizing. That's another piece of what Mississippian is. And again, this idea that some people are more important than others. And what we've got here is, on the left, when DeSoto comes from the southeast, every time you ran into a chief, they were being carried on a litter. And so those really important people were treated differently from everybody else. They didn't grow their own food, they didn't build their own houses. They had another special purpose, which was really to lead the community, but also to be that intermediary with the supernatural. The one on the right is from the French among the Natchez, when the war leader, the great Grand Village of the Natchez died. His name was Tattooed Serpent. The French describe this whole elaborate ceremony that he's taken from his house up into a mound and put on top of the mound. So treatment, differential treatment, is part of how we understand what the social ranking was about. We also know in terms of the things that people had and where they lived, how the size of their house, where their house was, and we can understand some people are more important than others. And again, the key factor is that it's not something somebody accumulated throughout their life. They were born with this importance, and it stayed with them their entire lives. And that's sort of institutionalized in society. So there's the social ranking. You can see how important people are treated. They have special food. They got better cuts of meat. They might have gotten more corn. There are lots of things like that. In terms of organizing communities, remember I said when you're an agriculturalist, you kind of stay in one place quite a while. But you also want to stay there in order to guard that space because your garden is there. And we see, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, these densely settled communities. But they're all sort of organized in the same way. The center is this open space. If it's a small town, it might just have a pole in it, but it might have a mound or a couple of mounds and plazas, and then there's a ring of houses around it, and then oftentimes there's a palisade wall around it. Here's the smaller version of that. There's no mound, but there is that center pole. I'm pretty sure I'm going to show you this. What we think we understand about how Mississippian people thought about the cosmos, there's three realms. People live on the earthly plane, which is a chunk of land floating in the primordial sea. And the way that chunk of land is organized, there's the sacred center, there's space, there's the realm of people, and then you drop off into the ocean. And so what they're doing is organizing communities to match their understanding of that piece of the cosmos. That's another Mississippian thing. And when we get to, again, the chiefdom or the ranked society, the polity, what we have are not just a chief ruling one community, but a chief that might rule 7 or 8 communities spread out over a day's walk. People have actually done studies of the distribution of mound towns and non-mound towns, and a lot of them are spaced. The mounds are spaced more than a day apart, and the villages associated are 1 day's walk from the mound. So the mound is the capital, the other communities are out around it. They're bringing in tribute, they're bringing in food, they're bringing in labor, they're going in for political theater and religious stuff, but they're spaced out so there are gaps in between them. So we can see something about the settlement that reveals sort of an administrative hierarchy where there's one town ruling a bunch of other ones. So that's another piece of what we see in Mississippi. All right, so here's my cosmos. So we can see material stuff, mounds and other things. We can infer organizational structure from how people are treated, the size of their house, the distribution of sites, that sort of a thing. Looking at the imagery, Mississippian imagery, some of which I've shown you, working with some indigenous communities, working with sacred narratives, working with historical information. There's a group of people that have worked together to try to put together some understanding of the imagery and how it connects to an overall idea of the cosmos. And there are indigenous people today who see this. This is not something we've made up. This is something that indigenous people, and it goes much further than Mississippian. It goes throughout, really some of this is a Pan-American thing down into Central America, but a layered cosmos. This world in the middle, as I said, floating on the primordial sea. There are lots of narratives that talk about some creature diving down to the bottom of the sea and bringing up land, and maybe a turtle, and maybe a water bug, and maybe a crayfish. That's this world, a place of people, animals, certain spiritual beings. The above world is a sky dome, and it's thought of in different ways. The sun is up there. The sun is the keeper of moral order, sort of a creator being. The sky realm is the place of order in life. When you go under the ground, when you go under the water, it's the opposite. These two are sort of opposed opposites. It's the place of chaos and death. It's not hell in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's not a bad place. It's a powerful place. It can be a dangerous place, but it's a place where water comes from. It's a place where life comes from to grow up to feed us. And it's where souls come back from the realm of the dead to inhabit the bodies of new babies. And so there's a lot going on there. And there are different beings that are in each of these realms. The beneath world, when the sun sets, becomes the night sky. And the path of souls follow is the Milky Way, which you see in the night sky. And the entrance to the path of souls is Orion, or at least for some groups it's conceived of as Orion, but they don't think of it as Orion, they think of it as a hand and eye, which you see right there. And so we have this sense of the cosmos, and the cosmos is connected by a central axis, a sacred center. In the imagery, it can be shown as a striped pole or a tree, but souls, prayers, power, things travel between those realms. Ritual practitioners travel between those realms, and they travel along that central axis. And so we can look at the Mississippian imagery and start to recognize some things. So here's our cosmos, and here are the representations of the sacred center is either that striped pole or the tree, and you can identify where that sacred center is by the circle and cross. And the circle and cross with nothing around it is the center of this world, the earthly plane. If you go up, it's the circle and cross, but it's got like a sunburst around it. If you go down, it's the circle and cross spinning because it's a whirlpool. The Lord of Death is underneath the water, underneath the ground, and if you're not careful, you get sucked into one of those whirlpools, down you go. And so we can see pieces of the cosmos, the structure of the cosmos, in the imagery. We can also see deities or beings. One of these, the Lord of Death, at least in one instance, is thought of as, they call it an underwater panther, which sounds strange. It's got cat characteristics, it's got other kind of characteristics, but it lives in the beneath world. And here's a pipe, a pottery vessel, a copper plate, and a shell orchid that all have that same individual on it. You might ask yourself, if I'm a religious practitioner, why do I want to wear something that has the Lord of Death on it? Does that mean I'm a bad guy? What comes out of the beneath world? Souls, rain, growth, those sorts of things. And so when you look at these, you have to think about them kind of that way. Again, the path of souls, the Milky Way, and then the entrance is probably this hand and eye, which is Orion. And the cool thing is here on this gorget on the right, you can see the spinning circle with the hand and eye. Remember, the spinning circle is the entrance to the beneath world, which is the same as the night sky, which is where souls go when they die. And you see the same thing on the pottery vessel up above. And then we've got the sun, or also first man, creator, and he has a series of male sons or heirs that have the same kinds of characteristics, often depicted as a bird or a human bird combination, because he's a being of the above world, he's a great warrior, so he's a raptor, and he does all sorts of spectacular things. So we can see him in the imagery too. And then when you start to get to that, you can play around a little bit and appreciate the imagery a little more. Then there's your loop square from the, this is a gorget, it's got the loop square, and you can see the petaloids around the circle and cross. So basically what you're doing is you're kind of looking down the center of the cosmos from above. You're looking down, you see the sun, and then you see the center of this world, and the loop squares are the edges of this world. And then the shell, where's the shell come from? The ocean, right? And that's what that is, the beneath world. And so you get the whole cosmos in a nutshell right there. Anyway, that's Mississippian iconography and imagery, and we can see some things in it. And the fun thing is, if we think we're right with this, then we can put that information in archaeological context to be able to talk about why people have these things and what they're doing with it. But anyway, back to general Mississippian. Mississippian may cover this whole gigantic area, but again, there's a lot of diversity within it. And in this case, we're back to archaeology. So this is material diversity. So we are in the South Appalachian Mississippian region, which is materially, mostly in terms of pottery, different from the middle Mississippian. And then we've got things on the edges, Fort Ancient, Oneota, maybe even the lower Mississippian, that when we come back to the PD, they don't quite fit the Mississippian definition. And I'll steal my own thunder right now and say, that's not the most interesting thing, what we call it. The most interesting thing is, how are they working? What are the people doing? How does it connect to this wider world? But there's a lot of diversity within. We've got very big places. So this is the Cahokia site just across the river from St. Louis, hundreds of mounds, including Monk's Mound, which is about 100 feet tall, a gigantic place. There's Monk's Mound. It's got multiple terraces to it. And it's only a piece of this enormous scatter that goes all the way across the river in these different precincts. This is the biggest Mississippian place. There were probably on the order of 40 or 50,000 people that lived in this couple of square kilometers. This is the one place in the Mississippian world that we might call a city, in terms of the formal definition of city, which is there's more people living there than the area can support directly. It's got to be supported from the outside. This is a really, it's the biggest Mississippian place. And then we can look at Moundville in Alabama. And Moundville is 100 acres. It's got 20 mounds. It's another big place. And remember the mounds. These mounds are built a basket load at a time. People are making these things by taking a digging stick or a jerk hoe, digging up dirt, putting it in a basket, carrying it to where somebody tells them to dump it, and it's built up that way. Most mound stages themselves are only about that tall. And so any individual covering of a mound might have only taken a few weeks to do. But somebody's still paying people to do that. They're not paying them with money, they're feasting them. They're feeding them. They're probably also conducting weddings and doing ceremonies and all sorts of other stuff. It's collecting people together to do this. But every single mound represents a lot of labor, and that means important people had to be able to encourage people to come do this. They weren't forcing them, but they were inducing them. There's an aerial shot of Moundville. If you've never been to Moundville, it's worth the trip because it still looks like that. You can still go visit it and feel like you've gone into another world because there isn't a whole lot of development around. So let's go someplace small. This is someplace that I've worked. This is the central Savannah River area. You can see my little circle up there. It basically goes from Augusta to Allendale along the Savannah River, that central part of the Savannah River on the Georgia-South Carolina border. This is a place that I've worked for a number of years. The Savannah Riverside, which is a Department of Energy facility, is slap in the middle of it all. And I worked there for 10 years as an archaeologist, so we've done a lot of survey. But there are mounds on either side. There's two up above the Savannah Riverside, and there's three down below the Savannah Riverside. The pottery looks an awful lot like the Piedmont pottery around here. They have mounds. Remember that picture of Pharaoh standing up on top of the 6-foot tall mound? That's how big it is, 6, 8 feet tall. They're small mounds. They have mounds. They've got Mississippian pottery. We don't see a whole lot of evidence in terms of social differences in houses, as far as we can tell. When we look at the distribution of sites on the landscape, there are these mound places, and then there's little farms scattered all around. So how it's organized is a little bit difficult to tell. Here are two mound sites, Lawton and Red Lake. You remember, Moundville is 100 acres, Cahokia is a couple of square kilometers. Lawton over there is 80 meters by 60 meters, and the same for Red Lake. These are much smaller places with much smaller mounds. And remember, again, the scale of it means labor, right? The amount of people. It also means the history, how long they were building the mounds. But keep in mind that the mound is a symbol. So within certain parameters, that's not, the size of it isn't the most important thing. It's the presence of it, the meaning of it, and the fact that somebody's able to manipulate it that's the big deal. But we're talking about something much smaller in scale here on the Savannah River. And whereas Cahokia may have started at 1000 AD, none of them may have started at 1100, nothing gets going here until almost 1300. So we see Mississippian sort of pop up in different places at different times. And it's entirely likely that that's what we'll find here on the PD, that things don't get cooking until after 1250. But that's a question we can answer. So here's the distribution of the mound towns and some of the settlement. And yeah, there's sort of a hierarchy, but there really isn't. It doesn't look like a classic Mississippian chieftain. There's mostly dispersed little farms. This is the coastal plain. How's the coastal plain for growing corn? not so hot, right? And the floodplain here in this part of the Savannah River is seasonally inundated little hummocks. And so it's not the greatest place to grow corn. We find corn cob and pressed pottery, but we haven't really found a lot of corn, so we don't even know how much they're growing corn in the area. We call this Mississippian, but how's it fit in? We know this is something that comes all the way to the PD, from the Savannah River to the PD, from Town Creek all the way down to Savannah. The mortuary treatment is people are cremated and put in burial urns and then put into the ground. And it's the same thing here in the Lawton phase. We haven't dug any of these, but there are unsystematic diggers who do this that have been reported to us finding these sorts of things. But there really isn't any evidence that anybody's treated any differently in death. And so we've got some of the trappings of Mississippi that we don't really have screaming at us that it's organized like Mississippian societies. So is it Mississippian? Who cares? The interesting thing is that it's there, and this is how it works. And the interesting, it pops up at about 1300, and by 1450, 1400, it's done. It lasts for a century and doesn't stick around any longer. And after the mound towns are abandoned, people just go back into the uplands and do a mix of farming and hunting and gathering, and there's no more centralization. So that's another thing about Mississippi. Some places it lasts a long time, some places it flares up and goes away. Some places it flares up, goes away, it comes back again. And that's another really interesting thing to explore. So let's go to the North Carolina Piedmont. So you can see Town Creek is our northernmost Mississippian mound. You go further to the north and it's called the North Carolina Piedmont Village tradition. It's contemporary Mississippian, but what they're doing, there are no mountains. There were big villages. There's no evidence of social differentiation in terms of architecture or anything like that. They're growing corn, and they're definitely interacting with Mississippi to the south and in East Tennessee on the other side of the mountains. Do we call this Mississippian? We don't. It's called something different. Here's just a piece of one of the villages, so it looks like a Mississippian village. It's got a bunch of houses, it's got a plaza in the middle, it's got a wall around it. But what it doesn't have mounds, it doesn't have evidence for the social ranking. The only thing different from the Savannah River is in the Savannah River there are mounds, right? And so what we call Mississippian and where it fits really varies quite a bit. And that brings us back to the PD. So here's another map of the distribution of Mississippian. And where's the PD fall? It's outside of it, right? Because there are no mounds or major villages here. And you can look at the other map and you can see the same sort of a thing. It's definitely on the edge of the Mississippian world. And in some ways, that makes it even more interesting because it's on the edge between Mississippi and stuff on the coast that isn't and stuff to the north that necessarily isn't. And so they're walking in two worlds, and they're connected to all of them. And yeah, there aren't any mounds, but there's definitely Mississippian pottery, a complicated stamp pottery. And here's a few examples of some PD pottery. Some of the rim treatments. There's definitely the flake stone, the brownstone celts, that sort of stuff. There's even beads and gorgets. Now that gorget style is made in eastern Tennessee. And so they're definitely connected to things going on in the wider Mississippian world. And why wouldn't they be? They're not just staying in their houses all the time. These are people like everybody else. So there are no mountains. So are they Mississippian? And again, that doesn't matter. Who cares what you call them? The interesting question is, what are they doing? How are they organizing themselves? Can you have, if the whole premise of the leaders in a chiefdom is that they use the mound as a symbol to remind everybody that they interact with the deities, is there any other way to do that without a mound? And that's a question to ask, right? Are there non-mound ceremonial centers? There probably are. You think about a church, a synagogue, a mosque, that's where religious practitioners interact with God and help others do the same, right? Do you need the church in order to do that? No. And so This may be functioning like Mississippian, but the thing that's missing is a mound. Why wouldn't they have mounds? What do you think? What does a mound take?
People.
People. People that you can convince to come work their butts off for 3 or 4 weeks, right? And so maybe that's part of it. Maybe whatever's going on in terms of the people that are leading these communities don't quite have the gravity to convince people to do that. Or maybe they don't have the extra food, because you've got to feed them for a couple of weeks. Maybe they don't have the surplus to do it. Again, that's a question that we can sort of ask and answer. Is there social ranking? We don't know. We haven't done a whole lot of Mississippian archaeology in the PD to be able to look at communities, if there are communities, and the size of houses and those sorts of things. So it could be here, but remember my Savannah example. We didn't see any evidence of social ranking, and we still think it's sort of operating kind of in a Mississippian fashion. And again, that's the interesting thing. How are they doing this? What are they doing? How does it connect to the Mississippian world, and how is it different, and how does it make sense here in the PD? So are there actually chieftains or ranked societies? Again, that's a question we can try to answer, but as you sort of gathered, it's not easy to see in the archaeological record. But to the extent that we can figure out, it's an interesting question, so we can go from something as big as Cahokia to something as small as what's on the Savannah River, and maybe something even smaller or slightly different here on the PD. It doesn't make it any less, it makes it a little different, and I think it makes it a little bit more interesting because, again, it's towing the line between two different ways of doing things. And you've got to remember that people are doing things because they work, because they want to, because that's how they want their life to work. And so the interesting thing is, how's it working here? Are they farmers? Again, we haven't done a whole lot of archaeology to know. And here's where the excavations that are going to start Monday have the potential to answer that question, because there are shell features. And the shell negates the acidity of the soil, and so botanical remains, particularly charred botanical remains, are much more likely to preserve in those contexts. So what Chris and whoever's going to go with him are going to do the next couple of weeks may help us understand how people are making a living, and how much they're relying on corn versus other kinds of things. And it's an interesting question because, again, how much you rely on gardening affects what you do, how long you stay in one place, how big your community is, all those sorts of things. And then to me, equally interesting is how are they connected everywhere else? How are they connected to the coast? How are they connected up to Town Creek? Go over to the Wateree, and you've got several mounds over there. We see this gorge that comes from East Tennessee. There's a bunch from the PD, there's a bunch from the Wateree, there's a bunch from the Savannah River. So it's part of something that's going on. And it is a piece of ritual regalia. It's something individual people who do specific things have. And they probably got it from somebody else who had the same knowledge and right to perform rituals. So now we're talking about people in the PD that were connected to a network of ritual practitioners in other parts of the Mississippian region. So now we're talking about people who are seeking out this and then bringing it back, that may be transforming the way things work here in the PD or transforming their own individual lives. So how are they connected to all these different things? That's a really interesting question. So, what's PD Mississippian? That's what we're going to find out, right? Does it now look like it fits the classic definition of Mississippian? No. It's missing mounds. We don't know about social ranking. But again, that's not what's really that interesting. What's interesting is what's going on. How are they doing it? Why are they doing it? And how does it connect to this wider world that they're situated in and they're connected to? And yes, that's a plug for, I should have put Chris's phone number in here, but I asked Chris if it was okay to do this. That's a plug for what's going to start next week, where hopefully you'll begin the process of answering some of these questions. Archaeology is not a one-off. We've been doing archaeology on Mississippian sites since the early 20th century, and we still don't know everything. So one thing isn't going to answer them all, but it's the start of learning some things. So that's my story. I'm glad to answer any questions.
Questions about Piedmont?
Where's 38 FL125?
I don't know. Where's the bed?
It is in Lower Lawrence County near Pampa.
You want,
Like come out and see the site, like volunteer and help.
can you point to it on the map?
I'll give you that number.
Here, this is what I know. There.
Questions?
The Wateree Valley Society, were they more connected with Etowah or Mounds in Alabama or Arkansas?
No. They're actually more connected to what's going on. You see a lot more coherence from the Savannah River over to the PB in terms of like pottery styles and burying people in urns and those sorts of things. Then Etowah is something a little bit different. There are a few material things that come from East Tennessee that end up at Mulberry. One of those rattlesnake gorges was found in Mulberry, and some other East Tennessee stuff. But no, it's more akin to this area right here. Yeah.
Where is home?
You're not supposed to know. It's outside of Camden.
Is it toward Utah?
Which way is it? No, it's on the.
It's due west of Pampa.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What do you know about communication, language, how they, each individual tribe or language, common?
So this is kind of cool. The best thing we have is from when DeSoto comes through. DeSoto hits the ground in Florida, and he grabs some indigenous person who knows languages all along the way. He's kind of so we know there are people that travel around, there are people who are translators. Some of the areas, they're mutually intelligible, and the further you get away. So you're talking about, Siouan stock being sort of Catawba, you're talking about Iroquoian stock being what became Cherokee, and various versions of Muscogee, Nijidi that are sort of in the creek, and then you go further west and they get a little bit different. So they're probably loosely, like if you speak any of the Romance languages, you could probably get it for a lot of it. But there are people who that's what they seem to have done, has been able to move around and learn a lot of different languages.
With a lot of our technology, you've been able to identify email language?
I haven't tried, but Chris Judge, who I will tip my hat to, knows more about the archaeology in this area than anybody else I know. And so that's a great question when you go digging with Chris. Ask him. My guess is that if they were visible on LiDAR, we would know about them.
Yes, ma'am.
Are these presentations, this one and the previous one, are they accessible on your website?
They're on the website, and this will be soon. Previous one's on, I hope. Any other questions about Ken? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I told you we could save the best for last. This is really, I think, one of the most interesting opportunities we have archaeologically in PD. I think we're through the Archaeological Institute, PD, and Florence County Museum. We're poised to investigate it and really learn a lot, teach a lot about what the PD Mississippian looks like. And we urge you to stay tuned and come visit us and come back again. We'll have another series of lectures like this probably in the fall. And appreciate everyone coming out before we turn it loose. We have a thank you for Dr. King for being with us.
Yeah.
And please stick around and try to stay tuned. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.